Now, before we actually start the notes for 10.6, we are actually going to be getting ready for 10.6. And I need to make sure that you know some Algebra 1. So we are going to kind of review some skills. You should recognize this as a quadratic equation. And I need you to pay attention of why it is a quadratic. It is a quadratic because of that 2 right there. That is the highest power in the equation. And I need you to notice you have an A, a B, and a C that are coefficients. So if you can kind of just review this information a little bit before we start, your life will be so much better in this lesson. So number 1, I have factor and solve this quadratic equation, 3x squared minus 9x equals 0. Now notice that it says to factor. There's many different ways to factor, but on this one I'm going to notice that it is a binomial. So anytime I recognize that it's a binomial, I'm going to look for the greatest common factor, because you can see up here there's 3 terms. This one only has 2 terms, but it's got 2 x's. So you look at each term, 3x squared and negative 9x, and you ask yourself, what do they have in common? So they both have a 3 in common, and they have an x in common. So you bring that out front, and then you it's backwards distributive property. You factor it. So 3x times x will give you 3x squared. Subtract 3x times 3 will give you 9x. Now that is factored. Now the solve part. You apply the zero product property where you set each factor equal to 0. So you've got 3x equals 0 and x minus 3 equals 0. You of course divide both sides by 3. You get x equals 0. And on this one you add 3. So you get x equals 3. So for this problem you actually have 2 answers. It's because it's a quadratic, 0 and 3. Now number 2. Number 2 says solve. Factor is no longer there. Now there is a reason why this one's like that. This one's actually much easier than number 1. It does not have a bx term. It only has one x. So it's got that x squared. Therefore, we can get x squared by itself. So the first thing we do is we add 81 to the other side. And we get 9x squared equals a positive 81. We then can divide by negative or positive 9. And we get x squared equals 9. Now x squared is still not by itself, so I have to take the square root of both sides, and x equals. Now this is the part where a lot of people forget about this. The answer is a positive 3 as well as a negative 3. Now you cannot forget the negative in algebra. In geometry we typically throw it away. But negative 3 squared gives us 9, just like positive 3 squared gives us 9. So, if you have a binomial with 2 x's, you factor it. If you have a binomial and it's an x squared by itself, then you just solve it like a normal equation. So now let's look at question 3. And question 3 is a little bit different, simply for the fact of that it is now a trinomial. So you've got the A, the B, and the C. Now, for this, it clearly tells us to solve by factoring. Now, hopefully you can remember this from your Algebra 1 class, but this means to set up 2 binomial parentheses. So it'll look like that. And you have to get the puzzle correct. You have to get 4 things in there to make this trinomial happen. Now, here's the way you typically do it with guess and check. You write down all of your factors for 2, and you write down all of your factors for 15. And then you guess and check. The 2x squared will be here or here. So when you do FOIL or the distributive property, first needs to give you 2x squared. Then last needs to give you negative 15. So if I stick the 1 and the 15 in here, I need to check and see if the outer and the inner will give me 7 in the middle. So this is a 1x and this is a 30x. There's no way for me to get a 7. So I switch these positions. So I put 15 in one there, and then I get 15x and 2x for the outer and inner. I still cannot get a 7 for that. So what that means is 1 and 15 does not work for this problem. So then we go to 3, and that should be a 5, not a 15, 3 and 5. So if I put the 5 here and the 3 here, I get 3x and I get a 10x. Now if I think about this, I can get a 7. If this is negative, these have to be opposite signs. That's positive, so the big number takes the sign and the 3 will take the negative. That will give me 7x. So the 3 is negative and the 5 will be positive. Now if I check it with distributive property, FOIL, first is 2x squared, last is negative 15, and then the outer and the inner is giving me 7. So I'm going to erase all of these now. I have it factored. So 2x minus 3 equals 0, and x plus 5 equals 0. 2x equals 3 divided by 2. X equals 3 halves. Over here, subtract 5. X equals negative 5, and x equals 3 halves. In algebra, again, we keep the negative. In geometry, we're probably going to throw that answer away. Now, that leads us to some of you all just really do not like factoring because it's a little time consuming if the problem is really big or if it does not factor. So a little bit more time consuming method is the quadratic formula. So if you do not want to waste your time with the factoring, you can do the quadratic formula. And sometimes, quite frankly, you have to. Now, if you had me for Algebra 1, I made you sing a song. Most Algebra 1 teachers do make you sing a song for the quadratic formula. You need to know the quadratic formula. So this is what it is to find these x's. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and you put the whole thing over 2 times a. Now, the quadratic formula, what it does is it solves any quadratic equation. Okay? Now, it is time consuming. So you really want to avoid it if you can. If you can get it factored, it's typically quicker to factor it. But this is your backup plan. If you cannot figure out how to factor it, you do the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula also helps you know if something will or will not factor. It says, will this factor? So it's small, x squared plus 6x minus 64. There is a test for factoring, and it's right here. Okay? Underneath that is b squared minus 4ac. That is called the discriminant. And if you do that little expression that sits underneath the square root, it will tell you if it factors. So, for example, this is A, this is B, this is C. So I am supposed to say 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times C. Now, if this comes out to be a positive perfect square, then it will factor. Okay, so if it is a positive perfect square, then this will be able to factor. So let's take the calculator and let's see if this actually will factor. So I have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 64, and I get 292, and I square root 292. If it comes out a whole number, it's a perfect square. It's not. So the answer to this, will this factor, is no. So if you were trying to solve this in a geometry problem, you would have to use the quadratic formula. Now let's go back up to number 3, because this one did factor. So let me show you what would happen if you do get one that will factor. So 7 squared minus 4 times A times C. Now keep in mind, this is A, B, C. That's where I'm getting those numbers from. And I get 169. If I square root 169, I get a positive perfect square. So that's why number 3 factored in this case. So as we go through this next lesson for 10.6, You have to have a good grasp on your quadratic equations and your Algebra 1 skills.